Okay, thank you everybody who is tuning in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be for this edition of Concordia Live, Concordia's digital series that we launched at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, given that all of us could not be together in person. My name is Matthew Swift. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Concordia, and it is a great pleasure to have all of you joining us today, and a special honor to have today's esteemed panelists join us. Before we dive into what I can assure you is going to be one of the most interesting conversations and relevant conversations I think we have ever hosted at Concordia, I want to provide a few housekeeping notes to everybody who are on the SpotMe digital platform. First and foremost, I would like to make clear to everyone that this conversation is being recorded, and it will be posted on Concordia's website and social media following this event later today. The audience, all of you, are welcome to ask questions at any point through the Q&A feature, which is on the bottom of your screen. So please submit those questions. We only have 45 minutes for this discussion, so we will do our utmost to try and answer any questions that you all have. We will invite you to join the conversation, to ask your question, and then go off of the platform to hear the answer of that question. So please don't be shy. Use the Q&A feature if you would like to ask questions. If you have any other issues, please use the chat feature. Concordia team members are monitoring the chat feature at every point. If you run into any issues, please use that chat feature and we will do whatever we can to help you. And once again, this conversation is being recorded as part of Concordia Live's series. Let's get straight to the conversation, which is around combating disinformation. In full disclosure, our objective for this discussion was to really focus on the anti-vaccination movement and the spread of misinformation about vaccines. But in fact, today's conversation is going to be even more expansive about misinformation in general and the responsibility of the public and private sectors to address this issue. This is a heated and critical debate happening in the United States and happening in the United Kingdom. And so this will be a conversation that I think is most relevant to critical things happening around the world today. I could not think of a better group of people to bring together to discuss this issue. First, I'd like to welcome Secretary Amber Rudd, who is the former Home Secretary and Member of Parliament from the United Kingdom. Second, I would like to welcome Secretary Jeh Johnson, who is the former US Secretary of Homeland Security under President Barack Obama, and a partner at Paul Weiss, as well as an esteemed member of our Leadership Council. And lastly, I'd like to welcome Dave King, Chief Executive Officer of Digitalis. Dave is both an advisor to Concordia, but also Digitalis is a longtime global patron member of Concordia as well. And his firm is one of the leading reputation risk firms in the world. Thank you all so very, very much for joining us this morning, at least here in the East Coast. Good afternoon to you, Secretary Rudd. I would like to first start with Dave, because Dave, you approached Concordia about this subject and how important it is that we talk about this subject. Of course, talking about it through the lens of the anti-vaccination movement, but as I've just mentioned, we're going to broaden that discussion for today to talk about disinformation more broadly, given everything that is happening. But Dave, in 2 minutes, set the scene for this conversation. You're one of the world's leading experts on the subject. Talk to us a little bit about the current state of disinformation taking place, especially on online platforms globally.
Well, thank you, Matt, and hello, everybody. And thank you to Concordia, first of all, for hosting this. And my personal thanks to Secretary Johnson and to former Home Secretary Amber Rudd for joining us today. I think I might start, Matt, if I may, from the perspective of trust as it pertains to where we need to go to get out of this pandemic and the extent to which disinformation presents an issue in that context. One of the interesting things, to my mind, that we've seen over the last 15 or so months is the extent, at least in the UK, especially in the UK, of citizen obedience, of compliance with what the government asks people to do. And behavioral experts didn't expect this. You know, they expected lockdown fatigue, and that didn't come, at least for the most part. Public opinion polls suggest now that the public really gets it. Now, I suppose that the massive economic support that governments, both in the UK and the US, have given to communities, to families, to businesses, has sustained that public trust. There's an interesting political angle that I won't digress too long into, but of course, this has accelerated the trend of government being a more active part of people's day-to-day lives than it has probably been in 20 years. And people have responded well to it. Now, all that bodes well for recovery, because trust bodes well for vaccine uptake and for further compliance and for success. But counter that with the one fly in the ointment, which to my mind is the real and growing threat of disinformation, which undermines that trust. Now, misinformation isn't new, disinformation isn't new, and the anti-vax lobby isn't new. You know, we at Digitalis, we looked at anti-vax narratives 3-4 years ago, when we looked at the extent of the harmful narratives that were playing out in search engines, when parents were looking into measles and mumps vaccines. And guess what? The anti-vax lobby was all over the place. And actually those narratives were prominent and in some cases dominant in innocent research search phrases by parents of young children. Now, you know, the good news is, and I'm sure we'll come to it in our discussion, is that big tech is playing ball better than it was then. But we have some new problems now, post-COVID or in COVID. There are more hostile actors acting against our interests. So, you know, while the origins of the anti-vax movement are in the far left, in the US especially, we see far-right groups that I know Secretary Johnson will talk to, the likes of QAnon and others, who've joined that battle. There's more state meddling, you know, whilst you might imagine that, you know, hostile states, whilst the Russias and the Chinas of this world, you know, will do everything they can to create mischief, to mess with capital markets in the West, with systems and what have you. One would imagine and hope that in terms of vaccination, we all have a common interest. But no, there's more meddling from more states. And then we're seeing the new phenomenon of vaccine nationalism. So a lot of content coming out of China around the supposed Pfizer deaths with a view to undermining vaccines in the West and promoting their vaccines. So we've got an increasing problem that's spreading virally as it does. And I think that addressing the challenge is different in the UK than it is in the US. And I'll be very interested, fascinated to hear comments from our fellow panelists on this, because in the US, they protect far more freedom of speech with the First Amendment. It's much more entrenched right. It's difficult to remove, more difficult, I think, to pull content. And the far right, or as they call it in the US, the white nationalist movement, leads us to see, I think CNN quote that 44% of Republicans are vaccine hesitant now in the US. And I think in the UK, the biggest challenge we have is these marginalized minority communities who are more vulnerable to disinformation, less trusting naturally by their nature of government. And that's probably the biggest problem we have there. So fascinated to turn the discussion to Amber and Jay for their comments.
Of course. So Secretary Rudd, if we can, let's start with you, because I think to Dave's point, there is a difference in how the US views this issue and how the UK views this issue, but most likely similarities in terms of the effects, the dangers that all of this poses. And I would be remiss if I didn't flag that a member of the British royal family even described the First Amendment as, quote, bonkers. And so can we first talk about, set the scene for us in terms of in the UK, your approach to what you expect from the private sector as it relates to combating disinformation?
Thank you so much, Matthew. Great pleasure to be here. Just to follow up on some of Dave's important comments. I mean, we have in the UK had the most extraordinary take-up of the vaccine. And I think this goes to Dave's point about the public being very, in a way, supine to what the government has asked them to do. We are, of course, a nation that famously loves to queue, but we also like to think of ourselves as fairly challenging of government and of legislation. Turns out not so. And when we were hit by the epidemic, we actually believed everything and followed everything. And one of the reasons there was hesitancy in government about original lockdown, famously, the Prime Minister allowed a great big event, the Cheltenham Racing Festival, to go ahead. And we now know that was partly because they were worried that otherwise everybody would just go to the pubs, and they didn't trust people to actually engage in the lockdown. Lockdown's been incredibly successful. Public really stuck by it, partly, of course, because we were so well financially supported. But nevertheless, even without the money element, leaving that aside, the fact that people actually had to stay in their homes, allowed out for one walk a day, and generally obeyed it, was in a way extraordinary. I wouldn't necessarily have appreciated that people would do that. And then when we got the vaccine, actually, vaccine take-up in the UK has also been incredibly high. And we measured it carefully and found that people were very keen to get their vaccine. And there were lots of pictures of celebrities getting their vaccines, the royal family getting their vaccine. So it got huge amounts of support. I mean, I would draw a distinction between vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaxxers. In the UK, we've had an anti-vaccination league since the 1880s. And that is people who just don't want to put anything in your body at all to do with vaccination. Vaccine hesitancy goes more towards, again, Dave's point about trust. Do we trust the government? What actually are they putting in our arms? And that is much, much more fragile. And so keeping that trust and making sure that we limit the people who are trying to provoke vaccine hesitancy is important. And to answer directly to your question, I would hope that social media companies, that other private companies, media companies, choose not to amplify too much those sort of campaigns, because they do not wish us well. We know from many other incidents like elections that there is hostile state activity trying to disrupt the country, and vaccine hesitancy would be one of those ways to do that. We may come on to that later. Just to answer Dave's point as well, he is right. Despite the very good take-up in most areas, there has been some areas that culturally have been more suspicious of government action, and they have been more hesitant about taking the vaccine. And again, the way the UK has done that is to try to build trust amongst that community by having, for instance, well-known Black people or well-known Asian people going on the TV, going on ads saying, I'm having my jab, aren't I the lucky one, to try and build that trust. So building trust is part of it. And the other way, of course, to encourage opposition to vaccine hesitancy is to create a certain incentive. So my son, who is in his early 20s, said to me the other day, well, Mom, I'm not sure, it doesn't really matter to me, personally, I've had it, he said, and I don't really need to have the vaccine because everyone says the young people don't need it. And I said, yeah, darling, but you won't be able to fly. He said, here's my arm. When can we go and get that vaccine? So making sure that people have a reason to have it as well can overcome hesitancy, which sometimes is just wafer thin.
But Secretary Johnson, for $100, somebody could promote any kind of misinformation they want to on a social media platform that can have a very negative effect. And trust takes a long time to build. We have probably, correct me if I'm wrong, some of the lowest levels of trust in our institutions here in the US we've seen in some time. And so who's the authority here? Is it government, or is it on these companies? Who's the authority to say what is accurate information versus misinformation? And how do we even approach this correctly, especially as what we expect from the private sector?
Well, in terms of, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. And it's good to be with my former colleague, Amber Rudd, who was Home Secretary when I was Secretary of Homeland Security. Matt, I'm afraid to say that in terms of a truth umpire here in the United States, that is probably not the role for the US government. We have seen just in the last 4 or 5 years, ways in which the intelligence community, which is supposed to be an institution of truth, can be influenced, pressured by their political masters, depending upon who's in power. I suspect that in terms of trusted flaggers on things we see in the internet and the like, that responsibility probably needs to lie with a trusted private actor. But let me go back to the more fundamental question here. This is a program about, the anti-vax suspicion. I don't mean to promote that at all. I don't mean to promote suspicion about vaccines at all. But let me give you a fact. A little over 20 years ago, when I was general counsel of the Air Force, at the insistence of Congress, I flew from Washington all the way to a place called Dead Horse, Alaska, which is on the top of Alaska. It's so far north, all the satellite dishes are pointed this way, not up. And I was there to formally apologize to a small Indian tribe known as the Inupiats, who about 40 years before had been injected with an experimental vaccine by the United States Air Force because the Air Force wanted to test the effects of a particular vaccine on the ability to handle cold weather among their pilots. And so they went up to Alaska and they tested on this group of Inupiats without adequate disclosure about the heightened risk of cancer if you took the vaccine. And we were up there to formally apologize. Incidents where there was less than full consent in terms of a vaccine, an experimental vaccine, is in our history. And it still resides in our history to an extent. But that's not really the problem here. The problem present day is what we've already been talking about, is there are so many different places on social media where you can go, whether it's the UK or the US, to simply confirm an existing bias, prejudice, or suspicion that fuels the anti-vax movement, but that's just emblematic of the broader problem. An astronomically high percentage of members of the Republican Party believe the election was stolen. For example, for a while, a very high percentage of Republicans, the American public, believed that President Obama was not born in the United States. This represents a threat not just to public health, but to public safety. January 6th was our wake-up call in that regard here in this country. And it threatens to undermine our very democracy, the ability of our politicians in Washington to come together and do their job. They can't even find consensus around a January 6th commission because that has become so politicized, fueled by the conspiracy theories and the misinformation that now exist on the platform where most Americans get their information and news.
So, but to go back though, if government isn't in the US, if the US government is not the purveyor of truth, or I don't know what the truth monitor, if you will, are there examples from the private sector, Secretary Johnson, where you think that a private sector company has approached this correctly, given how much this is having an impact on our politics, on our day-to-day lives here in the US?
Yes, there are. I'll give you an example of an organization called NewsGuard. I haven't looked at NewsGuard lately, but the concept behind it is to be basically a good housekeeping seal of approval on things you find on social media and the internet that purport to be news. Red, yellow, green. Red means don't read this. It's filled with false information. Yellow is be careful, not the best. And green is yes, there are barriers to entry and standards for exit. And I think we need more of those types of trusted flagger organizations that exist to monitor what goes on social media, if not social media providers themselves.
Secretary Rudd.
Yes, I thought that phrase by Secretary Johnson's, the truth umpire, was so good, because that's what we're always all looking for. In the UK, up to a point, we thought we had it with the BBC, much admired, sort of a semi-truth umpire. but it's been really discredited recently over having lied to Princess Diana about getting an interview, and it's much debated about how significant that was, not only for how much she disclosed at that interview, but for her disrupted feelings of anxiety and paranoia overall. So finding that truth umpire, I think, is incredibly difficult, and may I say it perhaps here now, impossible. Every time we have a political debate, whether it's the Brexit referendum or a general election, everybody thinks they own the truth. And we don't have a truth umpire. And so we have to ask people to make their own decisions about it. And those of us who feel strongly about one side or another have to argue it. And I think it's a mistake to think that there's ever going to be a truth umpire, because everybody's biased in their own way. But on the other hand, everybody has somebody they like to turn to who they believe more than other people. And I think that what we're experiencing at the moment particularly is an overwhelming series of channels of information, which leads a lot of people to pick the one that confirms their prejudices. On social media, of course, their prejudices are constantly confirmed because of the type of people they follow and the way the algorithms work, which just reinforces those divisions. And I think that all we can hope for is trying to get people to look at different types of media, different types of information the whole time, so they can have a more informed opinion, because there is no truth umpire, and it certainly isn't the government. And we've discovered at the moment anyway, it's not the BBC either.
Well,
I might flag,
go ahead,
if I may, Matt, I might flag two more issues actually, because, and I also love the truth umpire. I think that's going to become part of our jargon now. I think one of the challenges is that the truth isn't always necessarily binary. In any of these areas of content we're looking at, there is often very clearly illegal content on the one hand, where morally or legally a clear view can be taken. On the other hand, there's benign, inoffensive content. And in the middle, there's often this raft of grey content where our respective subjective judgments might be different. And I have to say, I mean, on the one hand, when you made the point, Secretary Johnson, that private companies should be the umpire, I slightly cringed for a moment until you mentioned NewsGuard. Actually, we know NewsGuard, and we love the likes of NewsGuard. And I think they do fix part of the problem, in the sense that in terms of a fact checking, it's good to see in the UK, I think the ONS quotes that 10% of people now check fact checking websites, and 25% of people are sufficiently educated now that they recognize fake news is a part of the media they consume. And the more that happens, and the more they turn to sites like NewsGuard and verifications like NewsGuard, the better. I think one of the things that the NewsGuards of this world can't address is the huge volume of more informally published content across social media, every tweet, every retweet, all that stuff. And my biggest concern, to come to my second issue that I think we'd be wrong to ignore, is that when you look at the resource levels of hostile states, remember that Russia spends over $1 billion a year on disinformation campaigns. And part of that is simply amplifying other stuff that can just cause discontent, distrust, and generally cause mischief. And my fear is that Western democracies, we don't play by the same rule book, and we don't have the same resources. I mean, Amber, I'd love to know what reaction you might have got in HMG if you'd gone in and said we just need a small billion to counter the effects of Russian disinformation. What reaction you would have got. And I do worry that the rule book is different, and that presents another challenge for us in scale.
And of course, it's not just the money, Dave. The fact is that in a Western democracy, you tend not to say the whole time, we're the good guys. By the way, we're the good guys. You can't do that. All you can do is try and amplify the good projects, which hopefully will make people conclude that you're the good guys. If you rush around saying we're the good guys, people are going to get very, very suspicious.
Matt, can I make 2 points, please? First, and Dave alluded to this, there's a gray area here between outright truth and outright falsity. And that is a lot of editorializing in a space that should just be straight news. And my experience in government teaches me this. I would put out an announcement, let's say that, in the month of April 2016, there were 38,000 apprehensions of illegal migrants on our southern border. And that represents a decrease from the previous month of, say, 50,000. One newspaper will say, Secretary of Homeland Security reports decrease in overall apprehensions in the month of April 2016. A more conservative publication would say, Johnson announces 38,000 apprehensions on the southern border. The border is still out of control and they can't get it under control. Amber knows what I'm talking about. And so one of the problems we face here is there's a lot of editorializing and color that goes into what should be just straightforward news these days. The news is becoming more and more opinionated all the time. Even the conventional news outlets tend to have a lot of editorializing creeping in. Ultimately, I think the answer to this big problem tracks back to, in a democracy, the people themselves, the consumers, who take all this in and then make decisions about their leaders, government policy as a result. And ultimately, I think it's the responsibility of a citizen to be an informed citizen, not just read the tweet or the alert that is one sentence or two sentences long, but to do a little bit more for their own sake, to scrutinize some of the stuff that is being shoveled at them, which I'm afraid, at least in this country, we've gotten out of the habit of doing.
But if I can just real quick, Secretary Rudd, I just to both of to all three of you really, as an example, there is a lot of debate about the origins of COVID-19, and for a period of time, online platforms either banned or put some sort of disclaimers or screens over anything that really questioned the origins of COVID-19, or at least the element that it might have been something that came from a lab, for example. Yesterday, they reversed that. So again, are we not concerned in this? Yes, I agree, Secretary Johnson, education is at the core of everything, because all of us on who are probably tuning into this session today know to read multiple news outlets to hopefully get some, let's hope they read multiple people, everybody reads multiple news outlets in general to get a further picture. But in this case, it's the heads of these platforms calling the shots depending on what is happening today. And so what is the answer to that? Who's the authority?
Yesterday's announcement will fuel the conspiracy theorists, no doubt about it. I think the government, the CDC, those who regulate who is allowed on social media, on their platforms, do the best they can with the best information available. In a more scrutinizing environment, most people ought to say, okay, well, whether the source was a lab or a market someplace in China, the vaccine is still equally as effective to dealing with COVID. And yesterday was a setback in the sense that a lot of people say, "Aha, I knew it. The government's been lying to me." Even before the internet, people by nature are suspicious of power, and people by nature are always convinced that the government knows way more than they're telling us. And so all we can do when we're government actors, when we're senior government officials, is tell the truth as we know it, weigh the risk that you may have to walk something back if you say something prematurely. Like, yesterday, the mass shooting in San Jose may have been a terrorist attack. If I said that yesterday when I was Secretary of Homeland Security, I'd probably be walking that back today, which is why we have to be so careful about what we say and when we say it.
But so, Secretary Rudd, who's then the authority? Because I think from your perspective, to an extent, this is where then government steps in to regulate and hold these platforms accountable if disinformation is projected onto these platforms. They are now essentially responsible for what their users might post. Is that right?
Well, I don't really think so. I think that disinformation is a hazard of information that comes on platforms as it is on newspapers. I think that the responsibility of platforms is to prevent online harms, and we are doing a bill in the UK on that. But the fact is, it's so difficult to define, let alone get it right. What is disinformation? We've spent some time in the past trying to define extremism. We gave up. It's very, very difficult to find the right area. And I would add also, if I may, to follow up on Jay's points about the government sometimes getting it wrong. We spent the day in the UK here, some of us rather watching too much of it perhaps, when the former chief of staff to our prime minister spent the day in front of a select committee calling half of the senior people in government who he had been working with liars. And, you know, we talk about trust in government. I can tell you, he has undermined trust in government. He undermined it, you know, last year by, as he admitted himself, by his trip to a beauty spot in the UK and misled people about why it was the case. But so I'm afraid government is just as fallible as individuals and social media companies. And I was going to ask Secretary Johnson whether he also thinks that the kind of amplification of people's views is leading to more politics of division, which he has certainly seen in the US, and we are getting in the UK, that the public crave a kind of, I'm right, you're wrong. And that's what we had from Dominic Cummings yesterday, who were the villains, who are the heroes. But life isn't like that, and government gets things wrong as well. But if they find somebody who will tell them this truth, they will follow them. And I think it's having a corrosive impact on more progressive parties, whether they're from the left or right. So sorry, Matthew, a rather bigger question for the second part.
But I think your question was posed to the Secretary Johnson.
I am probably screaming in a very loud, crowded New York City subway, but 6 years ago, I gave a speech where I said, those of us in public life who have the ability to command a microphone and an audience have a duty to be responsible in our rhetoric. Now, a lot of politicians in this country don't ascribe to that theory. They just simply play to the suspicions and the prejudices of their base. If I could be constitutional lawyer for a second, and I'm not an expert, we have a constitutional right to free speech, same as exists in the UK. There is no constitutional right to the amplification of your free speech, however. You do not have a constitutional right to someone's social media platform unless a court somehow deems that platform to be a public resource of some type. But there's no, in general, there's no constitutional right to an amplification of your message. But if the government seeks to punish you for your speech in a private setting, then you could also the government could run into First Amendment problems as well. And so there's a distinction that needs to be made from time to time between the basic government guaranteed right of free speech versus the amplification of free speech.
But to that point a little bit, and I think let's throw a bone to the social media platforms for a minute, because I think that this is an incredibly difficult challenge. And to their credit, I don't know that we could have all anticipated everything would be the way that it is today, and how intense this has been during such a critical time in the UK and in the US. Yesterday, and Secretary Johnson, I'm sure you knew him quite well, but yesterday, a senator that I interned for when I was in college, John Warner, passed away. Great senator. I saw a link on Facebook of this Washington Post obituary. I tried to share it, and immediately something popped up on the screen that said, you haven't read the obituary. And you could still post it, but it gave this warning that you had to read it to post it. And I thought for a second, you know, that is the sort of thing that makes sense. They shouldn't tell me if that I can't share it, but flagging the fact that I'm about to share something I never read is an awfully thoughtful approach. So aren't there some good solutions coming out of the private sector on this?
Yes, I believe there are, and I think that's a good idea because it requires the reader to slow down, take a breath, take a moment to read what it is you're about to pass on to hundreds, thousands of people But again, I also come back to the concept of the trusted flagger or the truth umpire. Someone, if not the consuming public themselves, has to somehow warn us of the dangers of some of the stuff that gets pushed at us moment by moment in our daily lives. You know, if you want to learn about John Warner, who in my judgment was a great senator, I knew him as well. You're not necessarily going to get the Washington Post obituary first in the search. There may be all sorts of other sources that, you know, talk about the number of times he was married or whatever. And so there needs to be a way to elevate that which is trusted, which is a trusted information source versus a lot of the garbage that we see. The internet very often does not have the ability to delineate between the two.
So let's go back to Dave. I think you wanted to say something to that point.
Well, only Matt. Yeah, thanks. That you know, the only part I would challenge from your comment, Matt, about social media. I mean, you know, should we throw social media a bone? Absolutely. You then said that no one could have predicted the onslaught of misinformation. Actually, I think we could and we did. You know, now that said, you know, I've spent the last 15 to 20 years bashing big tech for their omissions and failures to act. You know, Google et al. Were quick in responding to child abuse, but slow in responding to countering radical content, radical Islamic extremism, and far-right extremism. I have to say, actually, that for the very first time, I find myself thinking they're really playing ball now. You know, so I mentioned earlier that when we analyzed the search engine landscape around the anti-vax lobby pre-COVID, it was bad, it was harmful. Today it isn't. So Google's playing ball. I think YouTube is a really interesting case study, because whereas if we look back to the counter-radicalization initiative, when, you know, we flagged to the UK and the US government various sophisticated promotion of harmful content designed to groom interested moderates in the West, and it was ranking prominently in search engines for innocent search phrases that would be researched by our children, our teenagers in the West. And that stuff wasn't moved quickly, right? Today it is. And what happened then was, you know, Google launched its redirect program, which effectively used that ad platform to serve up quasi-government ads, which, you know, I slightly laugh when I think about it. You know, I'm a disenfranchised teenager questioning Western ideologies, and I go online and I search something like, you know, what is a caliphate or what is Khilafah, and I get the government saying to me, no, come this way. You know, it's probably not the most effective result. But to counter that completely, what YouTube is doing right now, I think YouTube has served up something like 500 billion adverts in recent months. This very light-hearted campaign they've got around countering anti-vax. So I do think we should throw social media a bone. Some of them are doing it well. But just to come back to the grey point we were talking about, and Matt, you rightly mentioned, you know, this policy change yesterday, which actually wasn't, of course, social media as a whole. It was Facebook and Facebook only who changed their policy yesterday to say, you know, we'll no longer remove content that suggests the virus was man-made. Twitter's yet to respond as to whether they're going to do something similar. Now, whether that's right or wrong is not for me to say, but it demonstrates the challenge when the private sector is making subjective judgments on what's right, what's wrong. And surely it should be for government to determine what's legal, what's not legal, and what's harmful. And then for the big tech companies to implement technologies to follow policy and remove rapidly.
So real quick, because I know we're running a little bit out of time, we have two questions that have come in from viewers who have it. The first question is for Secretary Johnson. So much of America's disinformation tsunami of today can be traced back to the revocation of the FCC's fairness doctrine in 1987. Is there any value in attempting to resurrect it to help battle disinformation?
So I suppose that's worth an inquiry, not just for reasons of anti-vax, but for our very public safety. And if I don't get another opportunity to speak during this program, I want to just quickly point out the danger of the environment in which we now exist. January 6th should have been a wake-up call to how disinformation can lead to armed insurrection on our US Capitol here in the United States. There's a study done out of the University of Chicago by a Professor Robert Pape that studies the demographics of those who were part of the insurrection. And ultimately, the most alarming thing that the study reveals is that there are something like 10 million people in this country who would be willing to resort to violence because they believe that the election was stolen. So January 6th may well have been simply the tip of the iceberg in the current dangerous environment in which we exist.
So then as a second question that has come in, and this one is for Dave primarily. With unlimited means, and if a Western government treated its message in the same way a private individual might approach the protection of their reputation, how could misinformation be challenged or its visibility reduced in public spaces before it filters down into more informal spaces? Once there and adopted by people we personally know and trust, it seems to become a matter of changing people's minds and feelings, which is a very tall order.
Well, it's a superb question, is one we could talk about for hours. I mean, there are technological solutions to amplifying and demoting harmful content of one sort or another. It's a brilliant theoretical concept. With unlimited means, what could we do? I fear that with unlimited means, the means of the other side would continue to grow as well. The other side being hostile states. But I think there are, if it becomes an arms race, there are technologies that can play a role in rebalancing what people see on what platform. But I think far more realistic is the increasingly rapid removal of content. And actually, a lot of our work in and around, when we've been engaged by a number of governments to fingerprint hostile state activity and around disinformation, and mostly that's designed to then achieve swift removal and what have you. And of course, that can be scaled, So I think we can get better and better at it, but it needs policy from government, which is easier in the UK and the US than other countries where, of course, illegal content might have a very different meaning. And we need the support of big tech to remove quickly. And I think the pressure that the likes of Germany, Australia, and now India are putting on big tech, when they bravely stand up to big tech and say, you've got to get it down within 24 hours or it'll cost you billions, I think is helpful.
All right, last question, and I know it's not the fairest question, but eager for all of your answers. I'll start with you, Secretary Rudd. Final verdict on your side today. Who is the truth umpire?
In the UK, I would go to the BBC because, and this brings me to my wider point, which is, given that, as Secretary Johnson said, January the 6th was a wake-up call, and the person who was leading the untruth was the then former president of the United States. You cannot have enough media outlets out there who are going to be giving a counter view and publicizing what's going on to show what the truth might be, should be, rather than the president of the United States. So I think that having media outlets who are not, for instance, owned by partisan moguls and have their own agenda, having a few that actually try to speak truth, even though they sometimes get it wrong, is going to be the way to actually try and deliver truth to people.
Dave, who's the truth umpire?
Matt, you asked who is the truth umpire rather than who should it be, and I'd love to think that it should be policy informed by government, system deployed by big tech, informed by polling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But who it is the algorithm, and that's part of our problem.
Secretary Johnson, I think you're talking about this at 1 p.m. Eastern on MSNBC. Who should be the truth umpire and who is currently the truth umpire?
Well, I don't mean to give a public endorsement or plug for any particular news organization or outlet. When I come home at night and I want to get very often my default is to turn on cable news. If I decide that rather than having my buttered popcorn, I want my dry, unbuttered toast, and just give me the straightforward news so I don't hyperventilate, I would turn on PBS or NPR. But who should be the truth arbiter, I suspect, is a more complicated question, because the truth arbiter has to reside not just on television, but on, you know, all these different platforms where the public gets its information and its sources. And so this is a work in progress.
I'll leave it there. Well, thank you, everybody on the panel: Dave King, Secretary Amber Rudd, Secretary Jeh Johnson. I told everybody this was going to be an interesting conversation. It did not disappoint. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and looking forward to having everybody back for a future conversation on this subject.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.